Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We would ask everyone if you'll check your cell phones as we prepare to begin to see that they're turned off. That's always appreciated. And of course, our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Same case goes for our friends at C-SPAN. If they would like to email questions, we'll be glad to add them to the Q&A sessions. Our program will be posted on the Heritage homepage within the day so that you can review for future reference as well. Hosting our discussion this morning is James Carafano. Dr. Carafano is Vice President for our Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy Studies. He is also the E.W. Richardson Fellow. He's a graduate of West Point and a 25-year veteran of the Army. He holds a master's degree and a doctorate from Georgetown, as well as a master's degree in strategy from the U.S. Army War College. He serves on the Georgetown University's Homeland Security Policy Institute. He is a Board of Trustee member for the Marine Corps University Foundation. He's also on advisory boards for the West Point Center of Oral History, the Hamilton Society, and Operation Renewed Hope Foundation. Of note, too, he serves as president of the nonprofit organization Esprit de Corps, which educates the public about Veterans Affairs, the main topic of our program today. Please join me in welcoming James Carafano. James?
Thank you. Thanks. So this is the plan. What we're going to do is I'm going to turn to each of the speakers, and for the sake of time, just let them introduce themselves, because their introduction, their bio also has it kind of explains the relevance in terms of why they're on this panel, and they're each going to talk for 10 or 15 minutes or so, and then we're just going to open up for a general discussion. And this is kind of my favorite kind of event, which is I'm not selling something here. There's no real agenda. This is really, I think, an exploration of ideas, and so it's I think today we earn our moniker think tank. So I just want to before we get started, I just want to take a few minutes about why I chose this issue and why I think this is important. And then I'm just going to turn it over to the panelists, and we're just going to have that. So when you look at the notion of philanthropy in national security, why would you even think about that? I think there's a couple of reasons for that. So, and having been involved in philanthropic pursuits, in particular philanthropy regarding this area, the very first thing you get from people is, well, doesn't the government pay for that? Right? Doesn't the government do that? And there's actually a long history and tradition of philanthropy in the United States, in military affairs and in national security. I mean, as you know, America, in many ways, is a unique, almost a global pioneer in the whole notion of private philanthropy in terms of as a social good. It is in many ways something almost uniquely American. It's not just, in a sense, kings building castles for people or bridges or something, but this notion about the American people kind of choosing to give back in the way that they see fit. That's very much part of kind of the American ideology in a sense, and it's really the birth of this notion. And the notion of how philanthropy is somehow related to what people think of traditional government activities, that has an interesting history as well. So there actually has been a lot of philanthropy in the national security space over the centuries. Most of it is in where you might expect, which is in professional military education. So, for example, if you look at all the major military academies, they have a significant portion of their activities are related to philanthropic endeavors, and it's not just the military academies themselves. So the Marine Corps University, which is down in Quantico, which really covers everything from enlisted education through officer basic education up to the Marine Corps War College, and extends not just at the Quantico itself, but also into the fleet as well. A number of their activities are supported by philanthropic endeavors. And I just think people may get that, and just like any other kind of educational institution, people rely on philanthropy to provide a margin of excellence or a cutting edge or something above and beyond kind of the basic activities. But what I want to discuss today is not just philanthropy in that context, although the panel is perfectly willing to do that, which is kind of traditional and I think well established and well known. But to think beyond that, to philanthropy more broadly in terms of national security and military activities. In part, I think, because it is going to be a quintessential enabler to kind of get to the future. We could all talk about how the military got where it is today, But I think, regardless of what you our foreign defense policy over the last few decades, we are left today with a military which has enormous amount of operational requirements, has been undercapitalized for a long period of time, and is facing a diversity of significant threats in the future. And the numbers just don't add up. I don't think anybody on any side of the political spectrum argues you can get there from here. And there's a significant gap between the missions and capabilities that we have and the forces and the capabilities we have to meet that. So how do you bridge that gap? And I think in part, if you look at the fiscal realities of federal spending today, the notion that we're going to do a Marshall Plan for the military, well, that's not going to happen anytime soon, or we're going to come back and do kind of Reagan-era, multi-year defense buildup. Even if you had, I think, an administration which had placed a much greater priority on defense recapitalization, it would be difficult for them to figure out how to do that in the context of all the other requirements and fiscal discipline. And also, we have a defense industrial base, which has been shrinking for decades. So it'd be difficult in some ways even to find money to throw at things. So I think there's a gap there that in part, one key enabler to bridge that could be private philanthropic enterprise. And perhaps in areas that we don't traditionally think of for philanthropy, including research and development, actually building capabilities and assets that militaries and national security professionals use. So that might sound like, well, that is something we don't do. And actually, ironically, there is an American history or tradition of private philanthropy in the national security space in this area. It was particularly prominent in the period running up to and during World War II, when, if you look back, I mean, there were always periods in history where people said, the Wright brothers say, yeah, I'll be happy to build you a plane if you pay me. Or, I'll be happy to develop a tank, but I expect you to buy it from me, right? But this notion of actually developing capabilities, in a sense, handing them over to the federal government or helping the federal government develop that, that is something that really kind of made an appearance in the post-World War I era, and it really flourished up to World War II. I mean, if you look in the run-up to and during World War II, there's an enormous amount of incredible philanthropic activity, much of the history which has gone unrecorded for things like radar, for example, where the private sector actually did an enormous amount of pioneering work and research and development on their own and essentially just gave it to the federal government for free. That kind of disappears in the 1950s, in part because of the amazing, the large defense expenditures that we had in the early Cold War, where federal R&D post-World War II actually greatly exceeds private research and development. And even the private research and development that you do see in places like AT&T and Bell Labs, that is feeding directly, in many ways, into the military. So we kind of got out of the practice, and I think in the 1960s, there was this kind of great divorce between academia and the military over the Vietnam War in terms of national security being something that people would think about and invest in and everything else. So I think that tradition kind of died off, but I wondered if there's both a space and a need at the dawn of the 21st century to kind of revitalize this idea, to really help us bridge into the 21st century military capabilities that we need. So that's the thought and the question and the idea, and so I brought together three of the smartest people I know to kind of tell me what the answer to all that is, and if this makes sense or not. So I think we'll start with Rich, and then we'll just go down, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So again, thank you for coming and joining us on a Washington summer afternoon, and I think we're going to have some interesting discussions. So Rich, over to you.
You want me to start with a self-intro, since you're getting away with not doing that?
Yes, that would be good.
Okay. I'm Rich Dunn. I'm a retired Army colonel. I spent 29 years in the Army. I retired back in '98, and I spent about 14 and a half years with the defense industry after that. And I guess my claim to fame is I brought Jim into the Army staff when he thought he'd found a nice, safe place to be a long time ago. So anyway, I'd like to begin by thanking Heritage for the opportunity to participate in this discussion of an interesting and worthwhile topic. But I have to admit, when Irene Dana here at Heritage refused to let me plead ignorance and beg off from participating, I did what every highly skilled and seasoned researcher does when confronting a rather unknown topic, and I Googled it. And I came up empty. So what I find, though, over time is that starting with a blank sheet of paper is always an advantage, because it makes it more difficult for your critics to say that you're wrong and point out your errors. When I first heard the term philanthropy in defense R&D, it conjured up for me a kind of a mental picture of some brilliant, starving young inventor soldering together the next generation death ray in his or her garage, while being supported by the largesse of a next generation, highly patriotic version of Bill Gates. And having worked around and in DOD, mostly in the Army, for a few decades, I initially didn't see the value in that idea. But on reflection, and I might admit, over a glass of good scotch, I began to see more merit in it, but in a broader context. So let me briefly sketch out some of my thoughts. Number one, I started with the stated objective of the event, which is always a good idea because sometimes Jim tends to diverge from what it is he really asked you to do. But what we were asked to do here was to, and I quote from what Irene had put out, is to explore the concept of philanthropy in defense, to identify areas where philanthropic investment is most needed, and to discuss a framework for philanthropic defense research and development. So that's what we were asked to do. So the other thing, being a good left-brained engineer, is I like to start with some definitions. So I would suggest defining philanthropic defense research and development as providing philanthropic funding for activities supporting defense research and development for the good of the nation without expecting any tangible or influential return benefits to specific persons or organizations. And that specifies things a little bit more. And it also says we're really looking mostly to not necessarily the private sector, but more toward private individuals and less toward industry who might be using such an activity for, say, business development purposes like I did for a long time when I worked in the defense industry. So how might we develop a framework for looking at this? And so when you look at the purpose of defense research and development, it really is intended to provide a decisive technological advantage to the American warfighter. That's what's the whole process is intended to do. Now, in that regard, a lot of effort goes into evolving existing capabilities to make them better and better, like developing the next generation of fighter aircraft. This is, of course, absolutely essential, but in and of itself, it may not be sufficient to provide this sort of a decisive technological advantage against a well-funded and innovative potential adversary, and we have several of those on deck right now in the world. So this requires the ability to develop and field entirely new capabilities that, properly exploited operationally, can be decisive on the battle space. Radar and its exploitation by the RAF in the Battle of Britain is an often referenced example of this. So for this revolutionary development to occur, it normally requires three things. First, the new technological capability has to be developed to the point where its warfighting applications are recognizable, at least to the sharp-witted. And second, then some smart, and that's usually some junior and young person, mind realizes the overwhelming value of fielding this new capability and employing it in new and different operational concepts. And these first two steps, believe it or not, are relatively easy compared to the last. Because making this revolutionary capability a reality requires some very senior decision maker with both a compelling need for it and the authority to bludgeon the bureaucracy to make it happen. So if we use this sort of a framework for these three steps, where might philanthropic dollars provide the greatest return? Assume, for argument's sake, that philanthropic donors were able to provide $100 million a year for defense R&D. And in the philanthropy business, that's probably not chump change, right? So that's a lot of money. But compared to the some $63 billion that DOD will spend on research, development, test, and evaluation in 2014, this year, that $100 million is almost a rounding error. So we really need to look at some place, to find some place where we get the most leverage for our dollars. Where are you going to, if you can just spend a few bucks, where can you make the biggest difference? To make a long story short, and perhaps trigger a discussion, I would argue that it might make sense not to focus on these three steps per se, but rather to look more broadly at the flow of knowledge that enables them. For example, the scientists and engineers working on a technological capability, they're going to need sources of innovative ideas. The operational warfighters then need to understand the capability well enough to conceive of new operational concepts to exploit them. And the senior leaders need unfiltered awareness of how these new capabilities might meet their most urgent needs. And my experience is that the existing bureaucracy within the department does not do a great job of moving knowledge across relatively disconnected groups. And I believe it was Secretary McNamara, but I may be incorrect, who once said that when he asked the bureaucracy for options, he would always get three: to do nothing, to wage nuclear war, or to do what the bureaucracy recommended. So that's the challenge that you have. It's very difficult for the groups within the Pentagon to have this flow of knowledge that's required for innovation in defense. So the question then is, how can knowledge, and I'm talking about knowledge, not data or information, but knowledge, flow across groups that are not usually well connected? And there's a professor by the name of Ron Burt at the University of Chicago who's provided some very useful ideas in this regard related to the bridging of social networks. And Burt sees societies, organizations, corporations, the Department of Defense as comprised of groups or clusters of people connected by strong ties within these clusters and weak ties between clusters. This is not your standard org diagram that you normally see when you pull up something online. It's more like a bunch of separate galaxies with close ties in between and a few strong ties in between them. So, but these human networks that he looks at are not electrical circuits. The influential communication, he says, normally decays with only one intermediary and disappears into the noise much beyond that. The strong bonds between people are much more than friendship, than Facebook friend fellowships. And they're only formed when people really roll up their sleeves to collaborate on the same team and exchange ideas and thoughts and so forth. And Burt argues that these people with these connections across these different clusters have an early access to diverse and often contradictory information and interpretations that gives them a comparative advantage in seeing and developing good ideas. These connections allow them to broker knowledge by moving an idea that's mundane in one group to another group where the idea is new and valued. When you really look across the population, there are really very few really new ideas. But they're mostly new applications and combinations of old ones. But because information normally circulates more within than between groups, these knowledge brokers, these people who are able to move knowledge from one group to the other, are particularly valuable. And the creativity by brokerage essentially involves moving an idea from one group where everybody may have the idea to another group where no one has that particular piece of knowledge. And let me use my very simple engineering Dick and Jane example of that. Suppose, think back during the Paleolithic era and imagine a number of tribes living in widely separated valleys. In one tribe, someone invents a new way of lighting fires, the bow and stick mechanism that I was never able to work as a Boy Scout, right? And then you can imagine, once somebody in the tribe has developed this, pretty soon everybody in the tribe knows how to use that method, and they're sitting around in toasty and warm huts and eating, a hot roast mammoth or something like that. But now imagine a trader who moves across these valleys among separate, different tribes. Difficult transportation back in those days. The trader visits this one tribe. He learns the new way of starting fires. And then he ventures off into a far valley inhabited by another tribe that's lost their fire. They don't have any fire at all. Their fires have gone out. The members of the tribe they're freezing to death in the winter, and they're gnawing on frozen meat. So when this trader comes and he teaches them new ways of starting fires, he's treated as a demigod, or at least a genius, right? They say he's able to do that because he's taken knowledge that's mundane, everybody in one group knows it, and moved it into another. The value of that knowledge is what's important. So the point is that knowledge has great value when it's introduced to new groups who really need it. And without spending a great deal of effort, the movement of that knowledge can greatly increase its potential value. Therefore, what we might want to consider in exploiting defense, we might want to consider exploiting defense philanthropy to move the knowledge necessary to develop and exploit new technological capabilities across these usually disconnected groups. And that might be the best way we can really move the needle in defense with a limited amount of resources. And I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Well, speaking of demigods, turn over to Dan.
Okay, thank you very much. My actual bio is not nearly as impressive as that introduction. I'm Vice President of Lexington Institute, where, among other topics, I specialize in acquisition reform and translating R&D into actual defense products. And I have a background in both private sector, defense private sector, and several years in the Pentagon. One of the things I love about panel discussions, particularly the kind that Jim Carafano puts on, is it's, to paraphrase a famous American philosopher, panel discussions are kind of like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. And it's great because I took a very different approach than Rich did, and I think it helps this whole discussion. I want to start by observing that one needs to be a bit of a philanthropist just by virtue of being in the defense business. There's a commonly held view that the ticket to corporate riches is to be a defense contractor. Nothing could be further from the truth. As the last DoD acquisition performance report states, quote, private sector capital goods manufacturers have average operating margins 50% higher than those of defense contractors, unquote. It's a significant, if you will, penalty, or opportunity cost in being a defense contractor. And you talk to these people, and I'm sure Rich could vouch for this, they are in it, yeah, because they make money, and because it's a use of skills in many cases they've acquired elsewhere, but also because in a lot of cases it's great engineering, it's great science, and because in many cases, whether you're a big company like a Lockheed Martin or one that does a small amount of work for the Department of Defense, they are giving back. They are doing something meaningful. And it's remarkable kind of how much that does play into the choices people make between going to do defense work or not, going somewhere else where they can make more money. I want to take a somewhat expansive definition of philanthropy in defense. It's not the same as charity, right? This is not the giving to the less fortunate, although clearly defense is now becoming one of the less fortunate in many respects. Rather, it is placing the welfare of others ahead of one's own, whether it's an individual or corporation in this case, and acting accordingly. Another way of saying this is philanthropy are private initiatives to enhance public goods. Now, that doesn't mean that the activity is solely selfless. That is, there is no even conceivable fanciful gain for the one conducting the philanthropic activity. The private investment that led to the development of radar given to the government was not entirely without self-interest, right? Improving air defenses of those countries that were subject or potentially subject to air attack is of interest to all. So that's the public side of that kind of effort. I would point out to you, for example, that defense companies, like others, spend a lot of time in what I would call hidden philanthropy, the effort they make in education, paying for the education of young people, in doing kind of dual programs where you can be at school and work part-time in industry, is a remarkable effort on the part, a lot of money being spent, a lot of sort of co-working with local colleges. This is by the private sector, but also by the public defense sector, working in co-op kind of activities, working with local colleges to help them with programs going everything from engineering to welding, some of the kind of more prosaic kind of activities that give somebody a career for life, but they start out with this kind of relationship with defense industry. I would argue that is philanthropic in its characterization, right? It's doing what's right rather than what's easy or conventional or what will assure a company that they can earn the big bucks. Now, there are examples of philanthropic defense activities, broadly defined, that are more current than radar or the activities gone between the two world wars. Recently, for example, several private defense companies have shown what can be done in the way of developing and building new platforms and real capabilities on their own initiative without an RFP or even a recognized requirement by the military service and without money from the Department of Defense. So one example, using its own money and talent, In 2 years, Sikorsky, division of UTC, produced a revolutionary light attack reconnaissance helicopter called the S-97. Now, it did so for a number of reasons. It thought this might be a candidate in the future, but equally important, it knew it had to stay on the cutting edge of R&D. It had to keep its design teams kind of active and engaged, and it needed to attract young talent. Which I will argue, in some sense, keeping people in the area, engineering to begin with, and then defense engineering, secondly, is in fact, to some extent, self-interest, but it is also philanthropic. It is to the benefit of the entire country. Textron. It says in the unit, together with an outfit called Airland Enterprises, again, using their own money, took even less time than Sikorsky did to come up with the Scorpion, twin-engine light attack ISR aircraft, light attack and ISR aircraft, cheap to build, cheap to maintain, convertible, upgradable, mostly kind of out of existing parts, kind of like a tinker toy kind of exercise. And they did that with only a very vague idea that they could interest anybody in the department. This was a real flyer in terms of, Air Force doesn't like light attack, and it doesn't like something that isn't sort of their own invention and creation. Give you another one that's sort of on the cusp of between defense, non-defense, but kind of in the same place. Sierra Nevada Corporation is one of the 3 contenders for the crew capsule to return U.S. astronauts to space. All right, there's 2 other companies, but they're all 3 in the chase. They announced, because there's going to be an award to one company to be the new crew capsule to get us back in space, carry people to space. They announced that they will carry forward their vehicle system to a demonstrator. They'll actually put it on a rocket and fly this thing, even if they're not chosen as the winner of the competition. Right? And let's face it, I mean, this is not like there's a private market here for space launch capsules, right? If you're not going to be NASA's baby, but they're going to do that in order to further the state of the art and demonstrate the kind of technologies and activities they've designed. Maybe that then gets built into other things that NASA is doing. Clearly, I will argue to you, if they're not the chosen one and they go ahead, philanthropic. Now, what's also interesting about both the Raider and Scorpion programs is they were able to be successful, as I define it. Get something in the field, it really works and all the rest. They were swift and cheap in what they're doing because they were freed up from the limitations of a government program. Right? This includes being free from the extraordinary burdensome DoD acquisition standards in accounting, collecting data, technology specs, subcontracting, all the rest. Right? Now, the reason I bring this up is this raises an oft-ignored point in the discussion we have about philanthropy and government, philanthropy and defense. And I want to bring it out here. Philanthropy and charity are 2-way propositions. There is both a giver and a recipient. And Rich sort of kind of alluded, or actually mentioned this, but I want to give it more kind of substance, if you will, kind of spend some more time on it. Well, giving is nice. The value of the act, or the gift, both in concrete terms, but also psychically, can be diminished if the largesse is either inappropriate or misused. Right? Charities and philanthropic organizations, and even government, put constraints on the use of their donations and assistance, including public assistance, precisely to prevent their misuse. Right? Not supposed to be using food stamp money to go buy drugs or alcohol or things of that sort. Just one example. We have learned painfully over the decades that international foreign assistance efforts and domestic welfare programs can prove ineffective if the culture, psychology, organization, traditions, and desires of the recipients are not taken into consideration. So why we sort of no longer walk into a foreign country and tell them how to run their own country. We try and dovetail on this and try and be kind of appropriate, if you want to call it that, with aid, but learned at very great expense and pain. So, in thinking about philanthropy and defense, we have to consider the nature of the recipient, the federal government, and specifically the Department of Defense. Simply put, DoD makes it difficult for anyone, corporate or individual, to practice philanthropy. It doesn't like being the recipient of charity. There are even laws and regulations that limit the ability of individuals to give, or companies to give the Pentagon and the DoD kind of philanthropic gifts. If you've ever worked, I did it for a while, as a defense contractor, God forbid that you do work over what you charge, uncompensated overtime. That means, in fact, that you're not, living by the rules of the contract, the arrangement, the hours, and all the rest. But that is a form of, if you will, philanthropy, giving of your time freely to get the work done. It's a no-no in the department. So you can go to the department with a great idea, one that is even groundbreaking, but if there is no validated requirement, good luck. This can be the case even when unofficially everyone would acknowledge that the offering truly would be a game changer. The system is not rigged, but it is just biased, if you will, against ideas that don't come through the front door. Bring them in the back door, you're asking for trouble. Now, I will also say to you a particularly noteworthy example of the recipient problem for philanthropic endeavors involving defense, particularly at the corporate level. Maybe less so at the individual, the garage door, kitchen table kind of tinkerer and inventor, is how the Pentagon treats commercial items. For most commercial companies, defense is a very small portion of their business, and a declining portion. So if they want to sort of provide a commercial item to defense, to a certain extent, they'll make money back on it. It's not going to make or break it will not make the company. It may break the company, but it won't make the company. Okay? There are the companies that do this, particularly if you're new in this game, incur tremendous burdens when trying to deal with the Pentagon. They have to set up different accounting systems, deal with new engineering and technical spec requirements for products, and even have to tolerate new and different testing regimes and testing standards. When a company provides a commercial item to the Pentagon, under contract, we're not talking here about just throwing it over the transom, say a part for an airplane, it typically does so with the understanding that it will retain the intellectual property and will not have to provide certain kind of other information. Certified cost and pricing data is the big bugaboo. That if you built a product under government direction with government money, you would have to provide. Mind you, most commercial companies do not collect the kind of data the department wants on their commercial items, particularly not from their subcontractors, right? They don't care what the price is. They want to, what the cost is. They want to know what the price is. If it's the best price they can find, or it's a trusted supplier, or it's the best product, they will, in many cases, go for it without having to do the kind of exhaustive, mind-numbing analysis the department does. Okay? Even then, even if they're looking at price, they do not make the effort to ensure that the price of the piece that they're buying for their part to the government, or the price that anyone out there is selling their good on the market, is charged worldwide, something that the government requires when they want certified cost and pricing data. So if you send out a product, some of which goes to defense, the majority of it goes out there to a gazillion Walmarts and Targets of the world, right? You're required by the government to ensure that none of those Walmarts or Targets are selling those things that you're out for less than you're charging the government. Try doing that if you're a private company. Try doing it on a global product, right? So that's not even the worst problem. There have been efforts in recent years from within the Pentagon to change the current laws related to commercial items to give the Department of Defense extraordinary taking powers and to force the companies to go through this process of certified cost and pricing data, components, all that, subcomponents, and all the rest, right, on commercial items. Now, forget about just that this will make it cost prohibitive to buy commercial items, or the government will just simply turn up its nose in the end. It's just madness. So, my point to all this is when the Pentagon behaves like the Grinch, it can quickly sour the Christmas spirit of any company, or even individuals. Right? So, we were asked to talk about sort of what areas and how does one fix the problem, what areas to invest in, how to fix the problem, and where to go. I give some brief thoughts to that, because this is a tough problem. All right. The government in general, and DoD in particular, are not set up or conditioned, psychologically, organizationally, to deal well with philanthropy. So, what can we fix? First point, as anyone here at Heritage will tell you, the first rule of being a recipient of philanthropy is treat your donors well. And the department, when it comes to this kind of stuff, doesn't. Right? This is particularly important because we all know that whether it's on a philanthropic basis or simply the dependence of a department on commercial business, this is a direction that we're heading in. less and less defense unique production, more and more that's second based on existing commercial designs. Look at the new tanker, look at the new ASW aircraft that the Navy is buying, commercial derivatives. So if you're going to go there, whether for philanthropic reasons or just because you're now dependent upon the commercial sector, be nice to these people. Secondly, accept the 80% solution, at least to start. This notion of exquisite requirements and all the rest is just impossible, particularly if you want from the commercial sector, which is, they'll change it out if it's only 80% to get to 90. Anybody who deals with, a laptop computer or a piece of software knows exactly what I'm talking about, maybe even less than 80% if it's something that Windows produces. Thirdly, think globally. If you want to be philanthropic, it doesn't have to rest at the American borders. It doesn't even have to rest among us and our allies. It could be neutrals and third parties as part of this. Now, here's an area, I think, which is ripe for this kind of philanthropic activity. It's cyber or software. Think of how much of what goes on in software, public domain software, Linux. It's open source. People are contributing to this all the time. That's part of where the innovation, the kind of rapid change in innovation in software is coming from. Not all of it, right? And a lot of people are doing this just to be kind of interested and creative, including in some of the things in cyber defense. Go out to the Black Hat Society and all the rest. So one area I would suggest, even though this is going to be particularly hard for the Department of Defense, because if you kind of look at the guys doing cyber security or the hacker community, and you go look at the Pentagon, I mean, this is oil and water, this is cats and dogs, that kind of thing. But a great place to do it, because there's a tradition of, if you will call it, public good and philanthropy in software development, which the department could really make great use of if it wanted to. But it requires a different mindset. And let me stop there.
Great, so I'll turn to Pat. So,
okay.
And the most important part of your bio is that Pat and I are West Point classmates. So I've known him a really, really long time, and he's not just had a distinguished military career, but he's made that great transition to academia. So thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, Jim. And thank you to you and to the Heritage Foundation for inviting me to participate here in this panel today here. A little bit more on my bio. I was in the Army, as Jim said, for 21 years. I retired in 1998 as a lieutenant colonel. My last assignment, I was the PM for the ATACMS missile, which is a major defense acquisition program out of Huntsville, Alabama. I did work in defense industry for the next 14 years, and then I was able to get my PhD from George Mason University, and I made a transition into academia, where I'm now out at George Mason University running a STEM professional development program for teachers across the state of Virginia. But let me talk about this topic that we've been given here, and it certainly is a novel topic. In fact, in researching the subject, I found it difficult, as Rich alluded, to find examples of philanthropists investing in defense research and development. And as Jim and Dan have alluded, there are areas where there have been investments in defense affairs, but I narrowly looked at the defense research and development. And as Rich said, he looked in and started Googling, and of course I did that too. But also having a bit of a mathematical background, I started drawing Venn diagrams to see the intersections of what we could have. So I saw that there was the overall research and development in the United States and the overall defense budget, and of course there is an intersection there with defense research and development. And then I could see philanthropy, philanthropists giving into the, the overall into various types of philanthropic activities, and I could see them giving into defense in certain areas, and especially nowadays we see things with help to the wounded warriors and such as that. And Jim mentioned some other areas there. But then when I found it hard to see the examples where philanthropists or philanthropic organizations went into defense research and development. And of course, when you start peeling the onion back, as Dan just did, looking at some of the other areas, you do find that there are some areas out there if you look at a broader definition of the philanthropy. So I really think this is a niche market that we're looking at there, and we do have to carefully examine where it is. I did go look at, I wondered how did philanthropists and philanthropic organizations distribute their funding, and the Committee Encouraging Corporate Philanthropy reports that 28% of corporate philanthropy goes to education, you've heard that here, 27% to health and social services, 14% to community and economic development, and smaller percentages to culture and the arts, disaster relief, and other noble endeavors. The Chronicle of Philanthropy identified 9 causes that philanthropists' efforts fall into: advocacy, arts, education, environment, health, international, religion, social services, and youth. Notably, it did not list defense, research, and development. So, that, again, we have to expand the definition and look a little broadly. Then I looked at the amount of philanthropy and the sources that might be available for these efforts here. Overall, the National Philanthropic Trust reports that the Americans in general donate $335 billion to philanthropic efforts yearly. And that includes, of course, donated volunteer time, so that's a good portion of it. But looking in there, foundations gave about $50 billion and corporations about $17 billion, respectively. Now, this could be the source of the defense R&D funding that we're examining today here. Battelle in its in 2014 global R&D funding forecast reports that the total amount of R&D in America was $464 billion, and of that, about 2/3 of it, or slightly more than $300 billion, is funded by industry. Now, this is all of R&D, not just defense R&D, which is about the $64 billion number there. And overall government research and development reported in the Battelle report was about $125 billion. So we're looking at some large numbers here, and we're looking, as Jim pointed out in his intro to us there, looking for about $100 million. Where can we make the changes? Where a small investment can make a big change there? So then I looked at those sources for defense research and development and their motivations, and Dan touched on some of this here. I looked at government, industry, entrepreneurs, and philanthropists. And while I look at these individually, recognize, as I think we've heard, that they do move in and out of the different areas. And in one area, industry may be acting as industry looking for a profit motive, but at another level, they may be providing some philanthropy for their causes there. But industry and entrepreneurs have return on investment as their objective. And as I said, they can switch between the public good and the private return on investment. The government and philanthropists generally have the public good as their overall objective there. From all this research, I started looking at a framework began to reemerge. And then I spoke with Jim a little bit, and he pointed out the example, and we've heard this here, the development of radar at the outset of World War II as one example there. That effort was spearheaded by one man, Alfred Loomis, who brought together the necessary resources and talent to collaborate internationally and to develop radar. So I rolled that example into the emerging framework also. Now, Dan mentioned that, the industry investing in R&D, and they have a means to do that through their IR&D programs there, which allow them to provide funding at their cost there, but they still are looking for a return on some investment. Now, it may be that it's likely, or it may be something that they have some other motivation, such as just staying at the cutting edge and things like that. So those are all investments. And as I said, people and organizations are motivated by many different factors, not only one. So I didn't see that industry, while they give a good deal of philanthropy, as I mentioned earlier, they give it to certain other areas. And I've got a number of good corporate citizens helping to support the program that I'm running right now. So they give a good deal to education and community efforts. And they do also, the ones that are in the defense industry, provide a great deal of support for wounded warriors and other organizations to help those heroes. So what we need to do is encourage the philanthropists and the philanthropic organizations, or get these other organizations to act as philanthropists and philanthropic organizations, to consider defense research and development as another option for their philanthropic giving, at least on a small level. This will be a challenge, since a lot of the philanthropists and philanthropic organizations already have a mission assigned. They say, we're going to give to health, we're going to give to education, we're going to give to local community development, whatever it is. So we've got to get them to kind of look a little bit, open up a little bit, open their aperture a little bit more, and see if they can find something that would go into the defense research and development. Now, an individual philanthropist probably has a little bit more flexibility than a philanthropic organization, which does have the bylaws and charters and all the legal requirements of what they have to do and where they have to give their money. So we want to go and encourage some of the entrepreneurs and venture capitalists to consider giving a portion of their funds to philanthropic endeavors in the defense R&D area. Now, to be sure, many of these peoples and organizations already provide a good deal of philanthropy and support to many worthwhile causes. In fact, that is the role that Alfred Loomis, who was at Tuxedo Park, who helped to develop the radar, that's the role he played. He brought together the talent, the resources, the financial amount funding that they needed in order to make that happen. So as I look and I pull it all together here, I look and I say, well, what is the framework that I see? Well, first of all, I think you need to have the right individual to push an idea forward. And that individual has to have a passion for the technology that they're going to invest in. As we saw with Alfred Loomis, he was deeply involved in scientific research well before he got involved with the development of radar. In fact, that's why he had Tuxedo Park, his own labs built up in his homes in there. And then this individual who has this passion has to have access to sufficient funding to get the program going, or at least to keep it going if it's hit a roadblock in funding at some point in its life cycle. And this can either be from one individual or organization or networked to pull together a team of philanthropists to get the project going. Finally, and I'd say you need some catalytic event that's really going to ignite the person to get moving. We saw back in, for the development of radar, the looming beginning of World War II is what was the catalytic event that got Alfred Loomis starting to collaborate across with the British and get that project going. And then recently, I think we see that the 9/11 attacks could serve as a catalyst to get philanthropists going in this area here. Other considerations that have been touched on by some of the others there is, a philanthropist may want some kind of a financial return in there too. So if there's something holding out there, if there's a pony in there that they can grab hold of, they may want to, that may help to stimulate the investment there. Dual-use technology was alluded to in here as something that could be used both in the military applications and then also for a civilian application there. That, too, holds out a lot of promise for some of these people there. Public-private partnerships, matching requirements, having through the National Science Foundation, can get the philanthropists going in and focus that into the arena that we're looking at there. And finally, it could be that sometimes just a small effort to get the ball rolling. You see some initial successes, you see something that's more promising, you open up somebody's eyes to say, wow, that could really be promising there. That may be all that you need. It's just a small investment to get the ball rolling, and then you can bring in some of the other larger sources to promote the program there. So in summary, I think that any funding for defense R&D from philanthropy will have to meet some of the framework that I've outlined here, and it'll probably be a limited ability and a niche market there, but it can really provide, when targeted into specific projects and programs, can really pay a lot of benefit for us. So, thank you.
So we do have a couple of minutes. I'd like to get some questions. Do we have a microphone? So if there, okay, great. So if there is a question, if you just raise your hand and state your name and affiliation, that'd be great. And just wait for the microphone before you ask your question.
Henry Hedger, researcher at NARA. I wondered exactly what date did Alfred Loomis begin his work on radar at this point when the philanthropy begins to take effect. What is the date that this began? Is it around the Battle of Britain? Earlier, or, there was a great concern, in the White House starting on May 10th, 40, that we needed to rearm. And of course, radar is a form of armament, it's a protection. So that being the case, exactly when did this start?
I think I'd have to go back and check exactly, but realize he had been doing physics research for, throughout the 30s, from about 1930 on. I think that about 1938 is when he started focusing in on radar, and then he started seeing some of the results from the Battle of Britain, as you said, And that's when he started collaborating with the British and sharing information and technologies and moved it forward from there. So just about that time, and yes, the Battle of Britain was probably the catalyst that really got him moving and got him to expand his interest in the radar.
Okay, any other questions? So there's a couple of things that, and I'll take the time now to do this, that I wanted to pull together from the panel, and I thought were really useful points, and those were all extraordinary presentations. So one emphasizes the notion that of marginal investment, which I think is really, really important, and when you're looking at defense R&D. Because as you pointed out, it's a multi-billion-dollars a year that go into defense research and development. Increasingly, the trend is as the money for modernization and demand has shrunk and the demands have grown, a lot of that research and development typically goes into a sense bringing systems online. So the F-35, for example, a lot of what's R&D is setting up for procurement. It's not really what we would think of as traditional research and development. So that the R&D pie looks very big and healthy. When you take away the things that are tied to specific programs and assisting in the procurement of specific programs, all of a sudden that number starts to shrink. And so the point about operating on the margins is, I think, really, really important, because increasingly what the Department of Defense is forced to do is really cool, neat ideas kind of get put to the side, right? So even though it may just be a $100 million idea, that just may be something that's really beyond the capacity of defense to do. So this notion of marginal investments being very important for big organizations, I think is a really, really important point. We say, what's the big deal about Congress doing an appropriations bill every year? They move about 3% of the money, right? They don't touch 97%. So what the hell are we making a big deal out of it? Well, it's because out of that 97% is you take 50% off for salaries and 25% off for infrastructure and then 25% off for contracts. And then by the time you get to the marginal investments are 2 or 3%. But the point is those 2 or 3% could really be where you make a dramatic difference. So that's why I think it actually is a useful discussion to have. So each of the presentations I really thought brought together a really important point to think of in this space. And thought, in particularly, Dan made this really seminal list about transition and the notion that the hardest part of philanthropy is actually getting the recipient to take this. And in particular, he kind of outlined, I think, 3 really critical things that you would have to think about. The obvious one, which is, of course, the institutional biases, which is I have a program of record. You're providing me something that may be better, faster, and cheaper. That's a terrible idea. My career is in delivering this program, and a whole bunch of different competing requirements. But then beyond that, he got to the very practical ideas with almost everything even if you hand something over to the Defense Department, and it's a wonderful commercial product, it has to operate in a military environment. And there's going to be some kind of associated cost, what we talk about as RDT&E, research, development, testing, and evaluation. Somebody's going to have to pay for that. So if you say, here's the most wonderful widget in the world, Department of Defense, which is going to solve your IED problem tomorrow, I give it to you for free. It's still not a free lunch for them, because they're still going to have to go through some kind of RDT&E process, even if it's just associated with the safety certification of the product. So that's one model. And then the other thing is they have this terrible acronym in the military called DOTMOLS, which is horrible, but doctrine, training, organization, leadership, manpower, which is, okay, a wonderful widget. Somebody's got to train that widget. They have to, how am I going to use the widget? How am I going to maintain the widget? So there are a whole bunch of tiering questions that evolve from introducing any new capability, and that has to be, and somebody's got to pay for that as well. So that's another set of issues. And then there's a whole set of, the fourth one is a whole set of legal issues that Dan raised. So for example, you may have Buy America provision. So here's a wonderful widget. It totally solves your problem, but all its parts come from Switzerland, right? And so, we can't have that because, we're legally required only to buy this from an American manufacturer. So those are not insignificant topics. And it would seem to me that it'd be really ridiculous to get involved into a serious philanthropic effort at the level of $100 million if there wasn't somebody thinking about the back end of how to make that transition work. Rich brought up this really very, I think, interesting notion. As we think of research and development, capacity building, and we think of it in terms of maybe just hardware of delivering something. So here's a better bomb, right? But Rich says maybe the most valuable thing is really kind of the intellectual grease that leads to the better bomb. So for example, you talk about this, the lack of marginal investment today. If you work in the Department of Defense and you would like to go to a conference to talk about new fifth generation widgets, that request would have to go to the secretary of your service to approve that. So if you think about that as you want to go to a scientific conference, a research conference, that has to go up to the secretary of the service to approve that. I mean, it's just an incredible requirement because they're so, so stringent. And it's not even just a question of money as well. We can't appear that we're going to some conference in, Hawaii or whatever. So, and then I thought his point on networks was really extraordinary, is to create these really useful small networks where you can really have this dynamic, progressive thinking. That making that happen is really something. A really good example, for example, in the U.S. Military Academy, which in part this was a result of philanthropic effort. Some young officers got there and said, "Well, we need a collaborative tool to help young officers understand the problems of other young officers." And essentially what they invented with the technology of the time was Facebook. And if they had been a couple of states over in Silicon Valley instead of at West Point, New York, they would have been the guys that invented Facebook and got their own movie. Instead, they developed a product that was every bit as good as Facebook for free, and they gave it to the military. It was called CompanyCommander.com. It was a very, very successful, and it did exactly what Facebook did, is it created a network environment. But this notion of kind of the indirect approach, this maybe not just building something, but creating an environment that enables somebody to do that is interesting. And then Pat's point I thought was just great, this notion of creating this framework for a philanthropic environment. And it seems to me there's two really logical reasons why somebody would want to do this. Your point is the basic purpose of philanthropy, right? So if you have an interest in keeping America safe, free, and prosperous, and you could demonstrably provide the United States a cutting-edge advantage that would help do that, that's a logical reason for giving. But it's also tied, there's a second use there, which we both alluded to, which is this notion that many of the most cutting-edge technologies that we apply to national security today are really dual use, right? So we traditionally, what's the most important thing that a military could have and develop? And it's something the military would develop. So we see this throughout the Cold Wars, is jet engines, nuclear weapons, missiles, even the things that we use now, silicon components, those all were generated military requirements, and the military was doing the most important cutting-edge science for national security. But if you look today, many of the most cutting-edge technologies that impact on national security are things where the military and the National Security Committee aren't pioneering. They're actually following along and picking up the breadcrumbs. And Dan mentioned, cyber is a perfect example of that. I mean, the evolution of cyber, once it kind of ported over from the military side to the commercial side, is so expansive and great. The military is far from being a cutting edge on cyber. They're really just doing it. But what that also means is, if your philanthropic interest is the betterment of your society, in all likelihood, if you do something cutting edge that has a national security application, very likely it will also have dual use applications, which would be in the civilian sector. So some of the things that we mentioned in education, for example, we spend billions and billions on education. There's actually things educationally that can be done in national security, which could provide a leap ahead capability, which we then actually poured into the private sector. So I know it sounded maybe a little kind of, this doesn't really make sense, but the way you guys framed the problem and the challenges and the opportunities, I think there is something there that's intellectually worth exploring and important. And if we had a second discussion, and maybe I'll bring you guys back and we'll do that, and you look at some of the areas where potentially could you have really cutting edge technology capabilities, which could really make a difference in the modern environment. And I'm thinking of areas like robotics, human sciences, where there's an enormous amount of advances, material science, particularly nanotechnology, where either there isn't really there isn't really a commercial pull to really push the R&D, or it's something that's not being looked at, or the military side of the commercial application hasn't been fully exploited. I wonder if there aren't the $100 million investments out there that could really actually make a dramatic difference, particularly if there was a framework in which you could have that transition happen. So this was just extraordinary. Thank you guys so much. You're not only great friends, but you are truly, truly inspired and creative scholars. So thank you again. Please join me in thanking our panel. And I'm sure guys can stick around. If you want to come up, I'm sure some of our guys can stick around for a second if you want to have some additional discussion or conversation. Thank you again. Thank you for coming.